So John Morijn, who is professor of law in the University of Groningen. So it's you, so 20 minutes or so. It's just, I'm a little hard about the time. I was speaking about the time, just to have time to have a real debate all together. So I'm very sorry, because all you are saying is very fascinating. It's just to have time to have this debate with all
Absolutely no problem. So thank you very much for your very warm invitation, and I mean warm in more than one way. So coming from a land where your average lunch is one of a cheese sandwich, if indeed you're lucky, being invited to a conference where you get the menu of both a lunch and a dinner sent beforehand feels like a very warm bath. So thank you very much for the organization, and I love being here. So what I'm going to talk about is indeed the judiciary, and I'm going to talk really about the tension between purism and fait accompli. Because as Petra, and as I have to say, Julien, if you're on a panel with Petra, you will always be outshone, so I'll be sticking to my time very easily, because everybody's going to ask questions, only Petra, of course. Time is of the essence when you're trying to restore the rule of law, but how then you put your thinking hat on and imagine that you get the keys to the Minister of Justice in Poland on day one, and you are faced with a Supreme Court that looks like this. All the black images are irregularly appointed individuals. Irregularly appointed, so this is the highest court in the land, and there's a number of other higher courts that look precisely the same way. What do you do? This is a hard problem, particularly if you look at it in a black letter way, and I'm gonna skip 2 slides to make you realize a little bit how this felt like. This is a very famous judge from Poland that you may be aware of, Igor Tuleya, who was suspended for doing his work. And he basically described the situation as, I feel like Joseph K. from the trial by Kafka. I was accused of something which is not a crime. The matter was assessed by something which is not a court, and somebody who is not a judge gave a verdict which is not a verdict. So how do you deal with the problem? I'm going to skip back here. If this is not a court, what comes out of it? Is that actually a judgment? What if Julien and I were married and tried to divorce, and our marriage was dissolved by a body like this? Are we actually no longer married, Julien? What are the implications of this? This is a hard legal question. So, purely from the viewpoint of purism, what you want to do is just wish away this reality since 2015 and go back to day one. But fait accompli have been put in place. So what I want to problematize is why this is a hard problem in the first place, and I'm just going to talk about this. My position would be that you cannot actually unscramble eggs. There's millions of judgments that came out of this this mixed composition courts that have very large societal but also commercial implications. And, you are now the Minister of Justice. You are now in charge, and you have to avoid deepening the problem of by restoring the rule of law by breaking it again. You cannot just fire everybody who is in these courts, at least. I know that Professor Pesch will have a different position here, but I imagine that would be creating a very big problem, because that would create an even bigger dynamic in the long run. Namely, if you win an election, you bring your own judiciary, which of course might be problematic on a deeper level, and goes way beyond the constitutional hardball of Julien. But what do you do with all of these millions of cases that have been decided by mixed composition? So this is, I think, why this is a hard problem, why you have to somehow navigate this purism with fait accompli. And this is what I've been thinking about myself a little bit in some recent pieces on verfassingsploeg that I want to briefly discuss within the time. I think that you start in the end. I think that you have to, within the very limited time that you have, and as Petra rightly put it, time is always on the side of the liberals. So you have to envision what you want to leave your time in office with in 4 years' time, to make it at least a little bit less likely that the same precise playbook can be rolled out in the 6 steps that Petra put out so nicely. So how do you do this? I conceptualize this in Verfassungsblog as building back better, which is a UN theory was actually developed by UN agencies after tsunamis. That if you have houses on the beach that are washed away by a huge wave, you're not going to build back these houses in the same precise way as you did before, right? You want to make sure that you build something stronger. Otherwise, you will be confronted with the same impact of the same kind of wave. So that's one element of my argument. And the second element is that those who you would expect to really solve this problem, the venerable Venice Commission, have it that wrong. They're both wrong on the law and both wrong and on strategy. So I know I'm burning quite a lot of bridges in my career by being so openly critical of this venerable institution. But I'm going to explain to you why they're wrong both on the law and strategy. So for me, it's actually a very difficult problem because, and that's probably my third main argument, redemocratization is not rule of law backsliding in reverse. It's not like you're reversing the film and go back to the beginning. It's something different, and what it should look like if you are time sensitive and are aware of what you actually want to achieve, which is that you want to end up with something that is actually different from where you started at the beginning of rule of law backsliding. It's a hard problem. So I want to do this in 3 brief steps, and I will really keep it short to allow time. First, this is basically an elaboration on step 1 of Petra, how to capture a judiciary. What do you actually do? It's not so hard. I always say in the media, illiberals learn a lot more from each other than Democrats do. They basically copy each other. So there's quite a lot of things that you can learn in that regard. How did Europe's 2 top courts respond to it differently, and why? Why do the Strasbourg court's judgment have a very different outcome than the European Court of Justice? I think that the European Court of Justice has a harder job because it has to keep many more balls in the air than the Court of Human Rights. And then I want to present some initial thoughts, and Laurent evidently will not only disagree with me later, but also elaborate on this further, how you can actually deal with this problem. So how do you capture the judicial pipeline? First of all, you politicize the way that you appoint judges, for example, by changing the composition of a council of the judiciary. Typically, a council of the judiciary, judicial appointments can be done in any number of ways, but typically a European gold standard is that you have at least a majority of judges involved in this. Sometimes there's also people that are not judges that are involved in this. But of course, if you create a majority of politicians that select judges, then you end up with people that are not actually impartial and independent themselves. That's why they're irregularly appointed. But that's not the only, that's the beginning of the pipeline. There's also middle of the pipeline. Imagine that the 3 of us are on the court, and everybody knows that Julien is on the side.
Married and on the court.
Married and on the court at the same time, yeah. Imagine that everybody knows that Julien was appointed by Orban. The only thing that the court president needs to do is allocate sensitive cases to Julien, because they know that Petra and I will rule independently and impartially. So that's the reason why case allocation is also a way to capture the judicial pipeline. It can also be financing of the judiciary, threatening with defunding the judiciary, politicizing the financing of it. And of course, disciplinary action, if people do not agree with something that Julien, who of course is not an Orban appointed, but he is a proper judge, if he would then rule in a way that's inconvenient, just like Igor Tuleya did in Poland, you could misuse your method of disciplining in such a way that you sort of silence proper judges. One of them, I've often been in Poland on the ground. One of the interesting things there that I've heard from actually courageous judges is that there's a sociological dimension that I've always found fascinating. It's what I would call the 10-80-10 problem. A lot of people always seem to feel that there's a minority that are really politically captured, and there's a majority of judges that fight for judicial independence. That's not the reality. 10% of the judges actually fight. 10% are political, and 80% sits on the fence. They're thinking about their mortgage, putting their children to school. So they have a sort of strategic ambivalence, which is much more annoying to the 10% that fights than those who are actually openly political. So this is also what's behind it. Basically, to some extent, and this may be controversial, one of the most effective ways to capture the judiciary is for the judiciary to capture itself by not speaking out. So how did the two courts react to this? I'll be relatively brief on this. The European Court of Human Rights takes, of course, a fundamental rights, an individual rights element, and it takes a sort of kind of an end-of-pipeline approach in that if something comes out of a body that is not completely and only composed of independent and impartial individuals, namely judges, you can never have a fair trial because this is not a tribunal established by law. It's pretty simple as a strategy. So there's plenty of cases that where the European Court of Human Rights, one after the other, basically said this chamber of the Supreme Court is not a court, that chamber of the Supreme Court is not a court, etc. Eventually, to conclude that we cannot solve this, you need to have a legislation in place, which is the famous Wałęsa judgment, the pilot judgment, which basically says we're not going to deal with these thousands of cases that are now in the pipeline. You have to solve this legislatively, and then you end up in another problem of Petra's playbook, namely that if you don't control the key institutions, legislation might be needed, but you can't actually deliver on it. But there's a sort of straightforward line coming out of the Strasbourg case law, individual rights based, but there's now a suspended reality because the court has ordered something that the Polish government cannot deliver. The European Court of Justice has a much more difficult task, and I'll explain to you why. Because what is often underestimated, and when I am in Ukraine, I'm a consultant to the German government advising Ukrainian government, basically teaching judges there. What I tell them is the centrality of national judges in the European Union setting is absolutely crucial. The European Union is a system of decentralized enforcement. 95% of the way that law is enforced in the EU goes through a national court. So how do you then deal with a problem that some of these national courts, particularly top courts, are not actually courts? This is also a problem for the European Court of Justice, as I show in the lower right corner, because typically the most effective way to bring a case to the European Court of Justice about an element of European Union law is, of course, to ask a preliminary reference question. Well, what should you then do with receiving such a question by something that is not actually a court? It's a very difficult dilemma for the Court of Justice, because if it just says, we're not answering that because you're not a court, it's actually harming its own position rather than just enforcing on principle. So you see a very convoluted case law there that in some cases it mistakenly deals with a question because it did not understand initially that it was actually not a court that asked that question. And then it stopped treating such questions. And now there's a sort of a middle position recently that says that the very fact that something is put to us by the court, by a body that's not actually a national court, is not in itself disqualifying for us to deal with that question. This is it's a much harder dilemma for the Court of Justice because it looks at the system of integrity of the EU legal order than the pure and simple individual rights focus of the European Court of Human Rights. An even more complex issue, and I've written about that with Professor Bart, is mutual recognition. Because, of course, part of the way that European Union law is enforced is also that you sort of blindly rely on the trustworthiness of the integrity of another legal system. And sometimes, for example, if you have a European arrest warrant that is issued by a court in Poland and ends up in your desk as a court in Amsterdam, you have seen the same picture that I started my presentation on, and then you wonder, but can I actually just blindly say yes to this request from this Polish court? Well, the Court of Justice has been wrapping itself up in balls to try and not answer this question, having landed, and I've sort of ridiculed that solution together with Professor Bart, basically saying, if you worry about the independence of Julien, just ask him. So I would then, as a judge, have to write a letter to you as a judge. Are you independent, Julien?
Yeah,
it's
sure.
basically. I mean, so this is not only extremely uncomfortable, but it makes no sense as a matter of basic logic. So these kind of things make it much harder for the Court of Justice to because it wants to keep in the air for now the whole principle of mutual recognition, but it's very difficult to navigate that if you deal with the problem of judicial independence from its perspective for the reasons that it has to take into account more considerations. I'm going to finish on 2 more minutes and then I'm done. So what has the Venice Commission done in reply to this problem? The Polish government basically said, we want to fix this problem that I started with on the time limit that we have, so help us here. And what the Venice Commission said was basically, we start from the security of tenure of a judge. So basically what they said, I'll go back to the beginning of the slides for you to understand what the problem is. The Venice Commission here said, even if you're a colored individual here, so black, we have to go on the assumption that your appointment was okay. And it is up to the government to prove otherwise. So you have a sort of a presumption of innocence here. But that basically, so rather than starting sort of end of pipeline, like the Court of Human Rights has done, that if anything comes out of it, you're likely not going to have a fair trial. They start beginning of pipeline, making it much harder and basically also more time consuming for the Polish government to solve this problem, which I think is legally problematic, but also strategically problematic. Legally, because also the Venice Commission is actually wishing away the case law of its own court, the European Court of Human Rights. It simply doesn't agree with it. But it also takes a too narrow approach of what the law actually is, because for every country involved here, there's also EU law applicable simultaneously. And I've just explained to you that the Court of Justice actually gives different guidance here. But it's also strategically extremely unhandy, in my view, because the full name of the Venice Commission is the Commission for Democracy Through Law. So you would actually imagine that democracy is quite important there, including redemocratization. So you wanted to probably have as a strategic starting point that you help the person who gets the key to the Ministry of Justice in Poland on day one to make sure that when the mandate runs out, the situation is better. You don't want to give that person instructions that actually makes it even more complicated to go. So also I think it's strategically extremely unhandy. And my final word is, and Laurent will take over from there, how do you deal, what can you then do instead? I think that rather than focusing beginning of pipeline, you should focus end of pipeline. So you imagine that Poland and maybe now the new Minister of Justice in Hungary would put in place a law that basically says there's a new national law in place for the protection of the integrity of the right to fair trial under the European Convention on Human Rights and the integrity of the preliminary ruling procedure in the Court of Justice. So I encourage that judges actually are judges in both legal systems simultaneously, end of pipeline, result-oriented, and I encourage that they get into dialogue with their European counterparts. I think that would be a way to be strategically savvy in that regard, and also isolate those people in the national legal system that are actually irregularly appointed and empower those who are actually regularly appointed. So that would be my initial intuition of how you could go about this. And my last word is simply messy.
Thank you very much for this. I will have learned that you are still married, if I understand well. Okay.
Yeah,